This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, I want to share my screen so you guys can see that and see the PowerPoint hopefully soon. Here we go. Yeah, so tonight, really wanted to respond to a question that came up this past week. Let's see, I want to make this take this full screen here. And hopefully you can see the slide. There's only really two slides in this deck tonight. We're going to cover this pretty expeditiously and then open it up for questions. So what was discussed, or what the question was asked this past Sunday, I believe, and I think Greg asked the question about the Jan Markell podcast that came out on Saturday. Her podcast comes out and is available for listening every Saturday, I guess. Well, I listen to it. I find it on Saturday morning. I'm not exactly sure when they release it. I'm sure it's sometime that morning early, maybe in the middle of the night. I don't know, but it's available that morning when I get up, and I listen to it generally that morning when I'm working out. So the previous podcast this past Saturday had a portion of it where there was an interview, or at least I guess you might call it an interview between Jan Markell and Michelle Bachmann, and the title of the podcast was called "Countering Chaos and Confusion," and the date of that podcast is October the 10th. So if you haven't listened to it, it's a pretty interesting podcast to listen to. They didn't speak about the issue of the global reset during the whole and entirety of the podcast, but it was a part of the topic material at the beginning of the podcast, and it lasted probably maybe 10 minutes or so of the total podcast time, something like that, 10, 12 minutes, something like that. So the question really relates to and really ties back to something called the World Economic Forum. And I mentioned that previously. I think we talked about that in our first session in this series. And that too related to a Jan Markell podcast where she was talking with and interviewing a particular pastor who was very acquainted with uh, things such as genetic engineering and other sciences. And there was some connections I made there between what they were discussing and what we know is going to occur during the last days, and the way of plagues, pandemics, and other phenomenon. Well, in this particular podcast, they mentioned digitization of currency, and that being possibly a pathway toward a one world currency and the establishment of a one world currency. And then also the World Economic Forum and global reset was mentioned. Well, briefly, and this is what I've been able to determine about this so far. I probably have a lot more research to do on this topic, but the World Economic Forum meets annually, and they met in Davao, Switzerland, I believe, back in, if I'm not mistaken, late December, January timeframe of this past year. Then I think there was another meeting back in June, and then there's going to be a meeting again at the beginning of 2021. And as you may recall, in the meeting that they had in, I believe it was January of 2020, they mentioned that they wanted to. Soros actually had said that during this conference, that in this forum, that they really needed to push and work toward and hoped that Donald Trump would not be reelected, because Donald Trump is a nationalist, not a globalist. And those who are attending the World Economic Forum, the elites at the World Economic Forum, they are globalists, and that is not a secret. That's pretty clear from when you look at the World Economic Forum website, when you read some of their materials. It's very clear that they are globalist in orientation. Now, one of the things and what I want to talk about is, how could it be possible, and are there some pathways that we see today? They may change. If the last days are way out there somewhere on the horizon, on the distant horizon, then those pathways toward a global currency could change. But today, if the last days are anywhere near on the horizon, then we can identify pretty easily, I think, a pathway toward, or a couple of different pathways toward, a global currency. And the illusions that were made in the podcast this past Saturday by Jan Markell and Michelle Bachmann were to that effect. Now, they didn't go into great detail about what those pathways might look like, other than mentioning a digital currency as a part of it. So what I wanted to do was just share some thoughts with you about what I see in terms of the current scenario that could lead to and be one or more pathways toward a global currency, so that what we see happening today in the world, again, is the casting of the shadow of the last days onto our present age. So the question that I posed here for this particular session is, does the global reset of the World Economic Forum include a push to global digital currency that could portend what is to come in the last days? So I want to just proffer a couple of thoughts here in that regard. A global digital currency will be a part of the last day scenario. That's just a fact based upon what the Bible teaches about the Antichrist and the scenario that's going to be in place in the last days. As the Antichrist attempts to establish his global government, he's going to implement or try to implement a global currency. Now, the extent to which he's successful in implementing a global currency is subject to question. But the fact that he is going to attempt to do so is not subject to question. And the fact that he does establish a international currency over at least a portion of the world is not subject to question. That will happen. The big question is, when you have some of these other powers that are coming into play in the last day scenario, that wield power, like the kings of the East, the powers from the North, which we don't know specifically who those are, but we can guess that China and Russia are going to have some role to play. Well, if they have not yet subjected themselves to the Antichrist and they come to do battle with him or to engage in battle, you have to ask yourself, well, will he subdue them to the point that he's able to implement his global currency desires around the whole world, and even including Russia and nations like China? I don't know the answer to that. I do know that he will attempt to do so. He will have sway over large portions of the world, and he will have a multinational currency in place. And it's going to be centered there in the Middle East and in all the nations that surround Israel. So that's a part of the last day scenario. And here's the passage that I base that upon, looking at Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 17. And this is in chapter 13, as you may recall, is the chapter where we have the description of the two different beasts of the last days scenario. One beast being the Antichrist, and the other beast being the false prophet that is in Israel and requires people to worship the statue of the Antichrist that's going to be established there in the temple in Jerusalem. So those are the two beasts that are described in Revelation chapter 13. And here in verses 16 through 17, it's describing that second beast. And here's what it says: it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for this number of man, and his number is 666. Okay? So that's where we get this idea that there is going to be a global digital currency. Now, today, the currency, just so you know, and this is what I understand about global currency and global currency management. Back in 1944, there was a conference called Bretton Woods Conference, and it was the conference in which the International Monetary Fund was established under the auspices of the UN. The currency of every nation since the establishment of the IMF has drifted to a fiat currency. I don't know of any currencies in the world today that are not considered a fiat currency. And a fiat currency is basically a currency that's effectively, the value of it is dictated by its value relative to other currencies. If you really want to know the truth, it's sort of a shell game. And, the principle that you need to understand with regard to fiat currency that's very critical to know is that in a fiat currency system, money is effectively nothing but debt. So, and we talked about this, I think, previously, that money is nothing but debt in a fiat currency system. So, when you consider that fact, well, let me say a little bit more about the IMF. So, this IMF was established, and it's effectively a fund, and has many other things. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but I've tried to simplify it as simple as possible here for our discussion tonight. Is really a fund of national currencies that are used essentially as a channel of exchange and valuation of each nation's currency relative to other nations' currencies. That's effectively what the IMF does. Since its founding by the UN in 1944, the IMF has assumed the role of lender to nations which have become insolvent due to the over leverage of their debt to GDP ratio. And I'm going to show you something. Let me switch over here. I want to show you another screen here. Just a second. Still sharing my screen, I think. If once it comes up, hopefully it'll come up. There we go. So I'm sharing my screen, I think. So let me go here. I'm going to go to a website if I can get there. Oh, please let me go there. Are you going to let me go there? Yeah, okay. Whoops. Hang tight. Let's see if I can get there. Okay, here we go. Yeah, okay, so I'm sharing my screen right here. Let me know if you cannot see, or if you are unable to see this table that shows the name of the country, the national debt to GDP ratio, and the population of that country. If you cannot see that, please speak up and let me know. But I'm sharing my screen, and I think you should be able to see that.
We can
Okay.
see it. It's tiny.
But yeah, oh, it's tiny. Okay, let me see if I can blow it up just a little bit. Is that better? Go away, little advertisement.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, it probably doesn't help that you're looking at it on your phone, Sharon.
Correct.
Yeah. So look at this. This is fascinating. So when you're thinking about money being debt, well, gee, what happens if the debt of a nation becomes greater than effectively what's tantamount to its assets? What do we call that in business when the debt of a company is greater than the value of its assets and its ability to pay off that debt? Well, it becomes it's technically insolvent. Well, the GDP of a country is kind of like, the assets of that country. Not really, but you can look at it that way for purposes of our discussion tonight. Well, where does the United States sit right now? It's got a population of about 331 million right over here. It's got a national debt to GDP ratio of almost 107%. So we are technically insolvent. Technically. I mean, just by virtue of the fact, if you measure insolvency by national debt to GDP. Now, there's other ways of measuring it probably, and we're probably not, but just the fact that we have more debt than we have as a gross domestic product tells you, well, we're getting way over levered here. But look at Japan, 237%. That's the reason why they've had interest rates down to, zero and even negative territory. And then Venezuela, look at Venezuela. I mean, you're talking about debt to GDP ratios here that are resulting in currency devaluations of phenomenal amounts. Sudan, Greece, Lebanon, Greece has had a lot of trouble. Well, Greece has been one of those nations that the IMF has come in and lent money to save its currency and to save the nation, but it's also put in place a lot of what's called austerity measures. Basically, hey, if we're going to lend you this money, we're going to control how you operate. And if you go back several years ago, you might remember seeing in the news where people were balking at that because all these people who had all these government jobs, they weren't happy with the fact that now they weren't getting the kind of pay and they weren't getting the kind of time off that they were used to getting and the benefits that they were used to getting. All of that, those freebies kind of went by the way. So that happened in Greece and some of the other what's called pig nations. Portugal, here's Portugal right here. Italy was in that mix as well. Here it's still there. They've not really come out of that situation yet. And here's the United States. We're bordering on being in the same condition as some of these nations that have been in IMF, austerity measures in the past. Now, as you scroll down, you can kind of see other nations, getting close: France, Belgium, Spain. Then, as you move down this list, it's kind of fascinating. Canada is 88%. United Kingdom's 85%, which is fascinating that they're at that level. Well, part of the reason is, the United States historically has done things like, for instance, effectively been the major funding source and, source behind NATO and defense of European countries as well as other countries. So we've been effectively, funding the military, subsidizing the other countries with our debt. Well, we're getting to the point, and this was why Trump, when he pushed back against NATO and the NATO countries and said, wait a minute, you haven't been paying up. You haven't been even living up to the agreements that you would spend so much of your GDP on national defense. You haven't even been close to meeting that threshold. And we've been, and he knows that we're getting close to being in trouble here, and he's pushing those other nations to meet their spending thresholds per their agreement as a part of NATO. Well, anyway, let me go back to, I just wanted to show you that as part of the national debt to GDP scenario. Let me reshare this screen. Okay, so that gives you some idea of money being debt, okay? Because when a nation today issues money, it's an obligation of that nation. It's not backed by anything other than just the good faith and credit of that nation. That's it. So when you have a world that's in that kind of situation and you have a coronavirus pandemic breakout, and you have a government like the United States start spending money like crazy. I mean, trillions of dollars just in 1 year has been poured into the economy to stimulate the economy and to pay people, who have lost their jobs, because somehow we've come to think that the federal government has that responsibility. Now we have trillions of dollars of debt that's ballooned our debt scenario, our national debt scenario, and we're up to, I don't know, I think we're getting close to 28, 29 trillion dollars in debt, total debt that we have. If that being the case, and other nations following suit, what's happening? They're becoming insolvent. And once they get to a point of, insolvency to a great degree, here's the scenarios that could occur. For there to be a world digital currency, just a world digital currency like that's going to happen in the last days. One scenario would include the insolvency and devaluation of the currencies of many nations of the world, prompting a reset of the relative values of the currencies, such as what could be done through the IMF or an international agency like the IMF, or one nation or power with enough acquiescence or submission to it, think of China, to become the world's base currency. And that would be a first step toward establishing a scenario that could be levered by the Antichrist to establish that one world digital currency. So that's kind of my thoughts on this idea of digital currency and how that plays into, the last day scenario or a path to the last day scenario, I should say. Am I saying that, today, just because we have the rise of digital currencies and we have a scenario where we have a large number of nations that are effectively becoming insolvent, that we are therefore, on the verge of the last days based upon that fact and that fact alone? No, I'm not saying that. But when you take that fact and you say, well, let's look at what's going to happen in the last days, you can see a path, to the last days from where we are today fairly clearly. Now, you take that one thread and then you start combining it with many of the other threads that we've talked about and that you observe happening in our world today, and you start adding those threads together and you start creating a bit of a tapestry of a picture of what very well could be. And what could be is that, we are trending toward at a fairly rapid clip and an increasingly rapid clip the last days scenario. Now, there's a number of things that still haven't yet come into position, or we don't see them yet, that are probably going to have to be in position before those last days, come about. But who's to say what's going to happen in the next 10 years? In 5 years from now, the United States becomes 250 years old. Well, about 5 years, yeah, just a little over 5 years. The United States becomes 250 years old. And I think I've shared with you at least one writer's view in his study of nations, and the average age of nations, before they pass off the scene, is about 250 years. So we are approaching that average pretty quickly. And who's to say what's going to happen, in the next 10 years? We don't even know what the world looks like on the other side of the election right now. That's hard enough to figure out. And when can we stop wearing masks? When does that happen? And under what conditions? So it's hard to envision what the world's going to look like at this time next year. I can't even begin to put together in my mind what the world's going to look like in 10 years based upon the rapidity with which everything's occurring. But this issue of currency is definitely going to be something to keep your eyes on. So with that, let me open it up to questions and see if anybody has any questions. And I'll stop sharing here so I can see you guys. Let's go back here.
Steve, when you talk about digital currency, are you talking about something similar to Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's the idea. Sure enough. Yeah, and it can be, digital just means, gosh, how do you read anything that's digital? RFID chips and things like that. So you can easily see how something like that could be, the mark, on the hand, the forehead. That's pretty easy to see.
Hey, Steve, that I would imagine that the digital currency would still be controlled by the Federal Reserve, which is basically part of the World Economic Forum. Yeah, I like the Bitcoin. It's the value of it fluctuates based upon how many people's buying into it. So I guess, of course, we don't know how this thing would be pan out really, but I would still think it would be controlled through the Federal Reserve Board or Federal Reserve, right?
No, not necessarily. The Federal Reserve, I don't know the role of the Federal Reserve relative to things like Bitcoin. I don't know that they have any role relative to
No, I don't
Bitcoin.
think they do. Yeah.
But what I was talking about is the IMF and how the IMF plays a role in this as a global entity under the auspices of the UN. And for when you have a scenario where all the currencies are set relative to each other, you can easily see where if there was a power, and nations lost their, they become very globalist in their orientation. If nations become very globalist in orientation and don't see themselves as really nations, and they succumb to saying, okay, we don't really have a national currency anymore because we're going to basically become part of this global currency because we're going to have to reset the value of our currency, because we've gotten so high in terms that we've become so insolvent and our money's so worthless that we're going to basically turn it all in, effectively. I mean, this is kind of a analogy. We're going to give all our money over to this new fund, and now we're going to acquire this new money, and the new value of that money relative to our old money is, however much, cents on the dollar. So now we're all operating on the same currency as France and, Germany and Britain and all these other countries. And, that's the idea. So if you had that scenario play out, that's not too far fetched, honestly, the further and further into debt we go,
If you have that scenario, because right now, a lot of these currencies that are in the IMF, some of them have historically valued their currency on the basis of the value of the US dollar. So we've been the base currency for the IMF's dealings. But if you have another currency that says, oh no, the United States is so far in debt, we don't want to trust it to be the base currency anymore, then what happens to the base currency that the IMF uses? They turn to China, or they turn to resetting the Global Reset World Economic Forum. They reset the value of all currencies relative to a new currency. And that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see. And so basically overnight, really, whatever we have could basically just be diminished tenfold,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if your current if let's just say the United States, let's say it becomes, let's just hypothetically say the United States, its currency becomes so devalued because our like Venezuela, their currency is valueless, and the reason is because their debt is so high. Okay, well, the same with the United States. Let's say that happens to the United States. Our currency becomes valueless or very little. It's not worth much, uh, relative to other currencies because our debt is so high. Other countries have lost trust in our currency because, I mean, the whole thing's based on faith in the value of the currency and our ability to eventually one day, supposedly, hypothetically, pay it off, our debt. Well, let's say that they lose faith that we can pay off our debt. Well, at that point, then our currency being the base of what is used to value many other countries' currencies, well, they would say, no, we got to turn to a different base. And then there could be a decision by a globalist elitist group to say, well, fine, we're going to reset the value of all these currencies. We're going to basically create a new currency. And all of these currencies, we're going to go look at France, we're going to look at Germany, we're going to look at United States, and we're going to say, your currency, United States, is worth this much relative to the new currency. Your currency, France, is worth this much relative to the new currency. And yeah, exactly. What you might be holding, let's say you have $1 million in savings or $100,000 in savings, whatever the case may be. Let's say you have $100,000 in savings. Well, gee, now your currency now is only worth 5,000, 5,000 whatever. They want to call it, on the new currency system. So now you have 5,000 of the new currency. Well, I don't even know what that means. Maybe with 5,000 of the new currency, you can't buy that much. Well, you just had 100,000. Well, on the new currency system now it's 5,000. So that's the idea that and that's not too far-fetched a scenario. As a matter of fact, it's happened before. It just hasn't happened in the United States because we've been the base currency of a lot of these other currencies.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I know you mentioned China, but I had heard that between Russia and China, they were working to make the yuan basically replace the king dollar. So what you're saying is not too far-fetched, and what Jan Markell says is not too far-fetched when you put all these things together.
Yeah. Well, the reason I brought the things up that I brought up, like the International Monetary Fund, currency being, money in a fiat system being debt, they didn't really get into those things. But if you want to connect the dots between what they're talking about and the scenario that could ensue, then you kind of need to understand, I think, some of the dots I added to the equation in tonight's discussion. So,
no, I agree, and that was very helpful. I was fascinated by the chart there,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. And especially where Japan was. That was shocking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've been in trouble for years. Anybody else? Questions? Real quickly, I'll just say this and we'll close out if there's no more questions. I think I'm still sharing my screen, yeah. So if you go out to, the internet and you just look for like 2021 Reset and World Economic Forum, you do a search on that, you're going to get a lot of different articles, and it's kind of interesting to read through some of these articles. I pulled up, just before this began, I pulled up a bunch of them, and they all are talking about this. And of course, they get into some details that I didn't cover tonight, out of necessity and out of wanting to keep it pretty simple. But that's what they're all talking about. So it's pretty fascinating when you look at all this and you see what's going on and what's being discussed. It's definitely a known issue that's sitting out there that people are aware of. So any questions before we close out?
Hey, Steve, just looking at Japan, and this may be too much to answer in a couple of minutes, but
Mhm.
I'm just curious, like, like being in Japan quite a bit and kind of understanding their hard working ethic and their business acumen. It does surprise me that they are at that the debt to GDP ratio, and I'm just curious, like, how that happened, and if they're really that high, why are they truly not insolvent?
Well, I think they have been. And they've been in. I don't even understand fully negative interest rate scenarios because it blows my mind to think about negative interest rate scenarios. But that's where they've been in the past, and they've been dealing with this issue for, gosh, I think about a decade or more. Now, how it all came about originally, I think I might have known at one time, Caleb, but I don't recall right now. I can't recall exactly how Japan got into such a horrible scenario like they did. I suspect that it had to do with the massive government spending, with entitlement type programs. That's generally how this happens with countries, and I think that would be my suspicion. I'd have to go back and confirm that with Japan, though. It sure wasn't due to overspending on national defense, I'll tell you that.
Steve, I think they've had negative interest rates since the 80s.
Since the 80s? Okay, so it goes back that far.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at my notes from graduate school, but there were definitely commentaries about the Japanese economy back in the late 80s, and I know that they were negative interest rates in the 90s, and so I'm thinking it just carried on.
Mhm.
Anyway, if Caleb's really curious, just text us and I'll research it a little bit for you, Caleb. But anyway.
Okay. Wow, I didn't realize it'd gone back that far, Sharon. I knew it had been a while, but gee, that's quite a while. Okay.
Steve, when I was there in gosh, what was it? 82 to 84. I think the yen dollar rate was around 280 yen to the dollar. I don't know
Mhm.
how it really equates, but I know it was really high. And then shortly thereafter, it dropped, and it's almost been parallel with the dollar since. But just thought I'd throw that out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that has.
It's not really in parity though, Greg. It's like 100 yen to a dollar.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I do remember.
That's what I'm saying. It was 280, and now it's basically parallel to the dollar. Is that correct? I think that's right.
Well, no, 100 yen to the dollar about now.
Well, yeah, 100 yen to a dollar, so basically 100 cents to 100 yen. So that would be a dollar.
Well,
it would be the same thing. Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So, anybody else have questions on this tonight? Okay.
Steve, it's a fascinating series. I appreciate you going through it. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Caleb. It's it is kind of fascinating to do it, isn't it? And seeing some of these parallels. I mean, who knows? I mean, a lot of it's speculation. I get it, and I would never do something like this on a Sunday morning or something like that. It's too speculative. But to kind of open our eyes to how the last days could come about, and how what we see happening in the world today, which is in such a chaotic state right now that I've never witnessed in my lifetime. Something's going on. There's some definite reset happening, or in the process of happening. So I think it's really important for us to keep our eyes alert, and hopefully this series is kind of helping us do that. Well, this panel thing is jumping around all over the place, so I think we'll shut it down for tonight. Listen, thanks everybody, and I hope to see you on Sunday. Okay, y'all take care and have a good rest of your evening. And Nestor and Dadi, thank you for joining, and y'all have a good day there. Okay, all right. Talk to you later. Bye bye.